Self-help, how to argue and win every time. Introduction, the art of living and persuasion. Argument is not simply a mechanical tool used for debate in a courtroom or a boardroom. Argument is the fundamental mechanism of human interaction and the ultimate affirmation of our existence. Mastering the dynamics of persuasion means mastering the very art of living fully and authentically. Society conditions people from the moment they are born to conform, to remain silent, and to avoid conflict at all costs. We are taught to be obedient children, predictable consumers, and compliant workers. This relentless psychological conditioning forces most people to lock themselves away in mental closets where their true voices are never heard. True success in life requires breaking out of that psychological conditioning and embracing the raw, unpolished uniqueness of the individual self. The ability to persuade others does not belong exclusively to those with elite educations or booming theatrical voices. Every breathing person has the capacity to deliver a winning argument. The failure to persuade rarely stems from a lack of vocabulary or a deficiency in intellect. Failure happens because people affix mental locks to their own potential and refuse to share their authentic selves with the world. We live in a society that prizes logic and disparages passion. We are instructed to hide our emotions and present a cold, calculating exterior. This suppression of human feeling destroys the very foundation of effective communication. To argue successfully, one must tap into the wondrous well of their own personhood. Argument is the means by which we help others, warn them of danger, and express our deepest love. It is the instrument we use to struggle for justice and resolve disputes without resorting to physical violence. Without the ability to argue, the human species remains trapped in a primitive state where brute force dictates every outcome. We have developed incredible technologies, yet we remain surprisingly powerless to persuade each other to embrace fairness and compassion. The ultimate danger to humanity is possessing advanced technology while lacking the interpersonal skills to communicate honestly and effectively. We must learn simple, profound ways of speaking with our families, our colleagues, and our communities. We must learn to forward our interests without obliterating the relationships we hold dear. You have a power of your own that no one else in the history of the world can ever match. This power is the unique collection of your experiences, your pain, your joy, and your specific worldview. When you try to imitate the style of a famous speaker or adopt the values of an authority figure, you commit a form of psychological suicide. The imitation is always a counterfeit, and the counterfeit possesses no real value. The magic of a winning argument is born from the soul of the person delivering it, not from the cleverness of the rhetoric. Technique and structure are entirely useless without the authentic presence of the individual behind the words. You must give yourself permission to step out of your protective shell and demand the respect you deserve. You must stop trying to rid yourself of the traits that make you different. Before we begin this journey into the mechanics of human persuasion, I want you to leave a comment below and tell me about a time you backed down from an important conversation because you were afraid of the outcome. Part 1. Readying ourselves to win. Chapter 1. The reasons we argue and freeing the psyche. Fear is the single greatest obstacle to speaking up and making your voice heard. People are terrified of confrontation because they associate argument with anger, rejection, and the loss of love or status. We shrink from the pain of fear and choose the safety of silence. This silence is a living death. Fear is not a signal to retreat, but rather a vital source of raw energy that confirms we are alive. The dead experience no fear. When you feel fear, you are receiving a biological surge of power that can be channeled directly into your presentation. Instead of trying to suppress nervousness or stage fright, you must learn to embrace it as an ally. The great performers and the most effective communicators do not eliminate their fear. They look their fear directly in the eye and harness its immense power. When you acknowledge your vulnerability, you build instant rapport with your audience. Pretending to be fearless makes you appear arrogant and disconnected from the human experience. Admitting that you are nervous or deeply concerned about an issue strips away the artificial barriers between you and the listener. You do not need elite credentials, specialized degrees, or expert knowledge to be heard. Your personal life experience gives you absolute authority over your own truth. Society places far too much faith in titles and institutional validation. The wisdom of ordinary people, gained through hardship, labor, and survival, is profoundly powerful. When you speak from the center of your own lived experience, you speak with an authenticity that no credentialed expert can easily dismiss. You are the only undisputed authority on how you feel and what you have witnessed. This concept is grounded in the reality of your unique soulprint. Just as no two fingerprints are alike, no two human psyches are identical. When your argument emanates from your personal authority, it becomes utterly unique among all arguments. A polished, technically proficient presentation, delivered by a disconnected expert, will always lose to a stumbling, emotionally raw plea delivered by someone who genuinely cares. The audience recognizes the difference between a rehearsed performance and a desperate search for the truth. To unlock this power, you must grant yourself permission to participate in the dialogue. Many people wait their entire lives for an external authority figure to validate their opinions. They wait for a teacher, a boss, or a parent to tell them they are allowed to speak. You must realize that you already hold the key to your own psychological cage. Granting yourself permission is the first and most critical step in formulating any successful argument. Once you claim your right to exist and express your desires, your words will carry a weight that demands attention. We can observe the power of personal authority in practical, everyday situations. Consider a real-life application involving a junior designer at a major technology firm. This young woman was sitting in a high-stakes meeting where a senior developer was presenting a flawed product roadmap. The senior developer had decades of experience, an intimidating presence, and the backing of the executive team. The junior designer felt entirely unqualified to challenge his technical jargon. Her heart raced, and her stomach tied itself in knots as she realized the proposed software would frustrate the end users. Instead of trying to match the developer's technical vocabulary, she accepted the nervous energy in her body. She stopped trying to sound like a seasoned software engineer and spoke purely from her hands-on experience, observing actual customers struggling with similar interfaces. She described the frustration of the users in simple, vivid terms. She admitted she did not know the underlying code, but she knew exactly how the human beings on the other side of the screen would react. By bypassing the corporate hierarchy and speaking from her undeniable personal authority, she completely shifted the perspective of the executive team. She changed the company's direction not by being the smartest person in the room, but by being the most authentic. You must stop handing your authority over to others. When you defer to the conventional wisdom of institutions, political parties, or societal norms, you erase yourself from the equation. How can you expect anyone to listen to you if your words are merely an echo of someone else's thoughts? Successful argument requires two acknowledged authorities engaging in a mutual exchange. When you speak out of your own truth, you concede the right of the other person to do the same. This mutual recognition of authority is the only environment where genuine persuasion can take place. Chapter 2. When to argue and winning without arguing. We must fundamentally redefine the concept of winning. Society teaches us that winning an argument means forcing the opponent to lay down their intellectual arms and surrender. We picture victory as the complete destruction of the other person's viewpoint and the establishment of our own unquestioned dominance. This adversarial mindset is highly destructive, especially in our personal and professional relationships. If you define winning as pummeling your opponent into submission, you will eventually destroy every meaningful connection in your life. Winning simply means getting the desired outcome. Winning is getting what we want. This often includes assisting others in getting what they want as well. If the goal is to obtain a specific result, then argument must be viewed as a flexible tool rather than a blunt weapon. Argument can take the form of a hostile contest, but it can also take the form of a love offering, a gesture of understanding, or a cooperative dialogue. Words possess an incredible capacity to kill and maim the human spirit. The damage inflicted by verbal abuse is often permanent, leaving psychological scars that never fully heal. Using argument as a weapon of injury has given the entire concept of arguing a terrible reputation. Many people engage in repetitive, toxic arguments simply to trigger negative emotional responses in their partners. These disputes are not true arguments aimed at resolution. They are mutual flagellation exercises designed to inflict pain. We must learn to identify these destructive patterns and refuse to participate in them. Engaging in a screaming match over a trivial issue guarantees a loss for everyone involved. To win, you must understand when to remain silent and when to align yourself with the other person's perspective. Sometimes the most powerful argument you can make is no argument at all. Consider the common scenario of a husband furiously trying to start a broken piece of machinery while his wife points out his mistakes. The husband becomes enraged, not just at the machine, but at the perceived criticism from his spouse. The wife defends herself, and the situation rapidly deteriorates into a bitter exchange of personal insults. The original problem of the broken machine is completely forgotten in the rush to defend their respective egos. This entire conflict can be avoided by utilizing the strategy of getting on the same side of the problem. If the wife simply validates the husband's frustration and agrees that the machine is a terrible piece of junk, she removes the adversarial dynamic. By aligning her perspective with his, she diffuses his anger and prevents the argument from ever taking place. She wins without arguing because her ultimate goal is a peaceful household, not proving that her husband failed to read the instruction manual. Resolutions born from exhaustion and attrition are rarely sustainable. When a final agreement is reached only because one party is too tired to continue fighting, the seeds of future resentment are planted. True winning requires finding a path where both parties feel their core needs have been respected. Silence is an incredibly potent tool in the art of persuasion. When you are confronted with an angry or irrational outburst, responding with equal aggression only fuels the fire. Permitting the other person to talk themselves out of their rage often leads them to see the unreasonableness of their own position. Endurance, coupled with the perfect power of silence, is frequently the most effective strategy for resolving heated disputes. Some people argue continuously simply because they are structurally weak and need to hear their own voices to confirm their existence. They perceive any agreement as a sign of submission. These individuals bicker and wrangle over the most inconsequential details because their entire identity is wrapped up in being disagreeable. You cannot win an argument against someone who is arguing out of deep-seated neurosis or paranoia. Recognizing this allows you to step back and conserve your energy rather than wasting it on a fruitless verbal battle. Let us look at another real-life application of winning without arguing in a high-stress workplace environment. A project manager is faced with a vendor who has drastically failed to meet a critical delivery deadline. The project manager's initial instinct is to call the vendor, threaten to cancel the contract, and unleash a torrent of justified anger. However, the project manager realizes that screaming will not make the delayed materials appear any faster. The ultimate goal is to get the materials delivered, not to punish the vendor verbally. Instead of attacking, the project manager calls the vendor and speaks with calm understanding. He acknowledges that supply chain issues are incredibly difficult right now and asks the vendor what specific roadblocks are causing the delay. The vendor, expecting a hostile attack, is disarmed by the empathy. Relieved of the need to defend himself, the vendor openly shares the logistical problem. The project manager then offers a slight modification to the delivery schedule that eases the vendor's burden while still keeping the main project on track. By refusing to engage in verbal combat, the project manager secures a prioritized delivery and strengthens the long-term business relationship. This approach requires supreme emotional control and a clear focus on the ultimate objective. We must discard the ego-driven desire to prove we are right. Winning is about navigating the complex landscape of human emotions to arrive at a destination that serves our best interests. It is a strategic dance that requires empathy, patience, and the wisdom to know when laying down your verbal weapons is the surest path to victory. Chapter 3. Understanding Power and the Pistol That Fires in Both Directions. All power is a perception created entirely within the human mind. The power you face in any argument is always the power you perceive the other person to possess. The source of their power is your thought. The power others wield over you is a gift you have willingly handed to them. You give them all the power in the universe, or you give them no power at all. If you endow another person with power they do not objectively possess, you are essentially fighting your own creation. Your own mind becomes your opponent and your ultimate enemy. On the other hand, if the other person possesses institutional power, but you do not perceive that power as effective against your inner self, they have no real power over you. We are trained from birth to bestow power on others. As children, we saw our parents and teachers as omnipotent gods. They possessed power we did not have and could not understand. We carried this conditioning into adulthood, continually abdicating our own authority to institutions, politicians, and corporate entities. Take away the titles, the uniforms, and the corner offices, and the people holding these positions are merely ordinary humans. They suffer from the same insecurities, physical ailments, and emotional frailties as anyone else. When a lawyer puts on a black robe to become a judge, no magical transformation occurs in his brain cells. His sudden elevation to a position of immense authority is purely a social construct. The difference between the ordinary person and the person in power is simply the power they grant themselves and the power we collectively surrender to them. You must deal with power from a stance of objective reality. Once you understand how power works, it ceases to intimidate you. The threats, the fearsome rants, the pointing fingers, and the accusations of the powerful are almost always manifestations of their own internal infirmities. Everyone's personality contains voids and blind spots. Some people fill these voids with intelligence, while others use charm or physical attractiveness. When an individual lacks these positive assets, they frequently use raw, aggressive power to mask their deficiencies. The loud, abusive boss is not displaying strength. He is displaying a neurotic, panicked, grasping need to hide his own incompetence and fear. Once you see the terrified person behind the mask of authority, their power evaporates. Power is often an unbearable burden to those who hold it. It isolates the individual and creates deep loneliness. The boss, who was once a peer, is now separated from his friends. The judge is segregated from the community. Power creates boundaries that prevent authentic human connection. Furthermore, power is inherently destructive when used as a weapon. Power is like a pistol with barrels pointing in both directions. When a person with superior power pulls the trigger to crush someone with lesser power, one bullet strikes the intended victim, while the other fires directly into the soul of the shooter. Using power to intimidate or destroy germinates resentment and reaps a harvest of absolute hatred. It fosters a deep, abiding need for revenge in the victim. The application of excessive power reveals cowardice and grave personality defects. You must refuse to relinquish your internal power to your opponent. You can spend all your energy worrying about the other person's wealth, status, or rhetorical skill, thereby transferring your strength to them. Instead, you must retain your power by anchoring yourself in your own authenticity. You have the exclusive power to determine how you will react to any threat. You may be afraid, but you control how you process that fear. The ultimate security in life is the self. No one can seize the center of your psychological universe without your explicit permission. Consider a real-life application of this principle in a high-stakes corporate environment. A mid-level manager named David is called into the office of a famously tyrannical executive vice president. This executive is known for destroying careers, humiliating subordinates in public, and using his positional power to enforce absolute compliance. Most employees enter his office trembling, having already surrendered their power before the conversation begins. David, however, understands the mechanics of power. He realizes the executive's rage is a projection of immense corporate pressure and deep-seated personal insecurity. As the executive begins to scream about a missed quarterly projection, David does not cower. He does not internalize the attack, nor does he attempt to fight back with aggressive defensive maneuvers. He simply sits in his chair, breathing calmly, observing the executive as a flawed, stressed human being rather than an omnipotent god. David visualizes a glass wall between them, allowing the noise to bounce off harmlessly. When the executive exhausts his rant and demands an explanation, David speaks in a quiet, measured, and completely unintimidated voice. He outlines the logistical realities of the quarter without a single note of apology or fear. The executive, completely deprived of the fearful reaction he relies upon to fuel his dominance, is instantly disarmed. By refusing to grant the executive permission to terrorize him, David neutralizes the power dynamic and forces a rational, productive conversation. He wins the interaction simply by retaining his own internal sovereignty. Chapter 4. The incredible power of credibility and standing naked. You can possess the quickest mind in the room and master all the technical devices of debate, but if you lack credibility, you will never persuade anyone. The most eloquent oration is entirely useless if the audience does not believe you. To win, you must be believed. To be believed, you must be believable. To be believable, you must tell the truth. This means telling the whole truth about yourself, including the parts that make you uncomfortable. You must learn the profound art of abandoning trickery and standing psychologically naked before your audience. Humans are biologically equipped with highly sensitive, invisible credibility detectors. Think of these detectors as psychic tentacles that constantly reach out to palpate, measure, and test the speaker. These tentacles search for hidden malice, deception, and the thin, hollow clank of the counterfeit. When we argue, our audience is unconsciously analyzing every signal we emit. They are measuring whether the words we choose match the tone of our voice and the micro-expressions on our face. If a person smiles while speaking of deep sorrow, the psychic tentacles immediately sound an alarm. The system searches for anything that is out of synchronization. You cannot successfully fake authenticity if you attempt to consciously control your body language, your eye contact, and your vocal inflection all at once. You will appear stiff, robotic, and unbelievable. Trying to manage the hundreds of physiological signals you send during a conversation is like trying to manually operate your own digestive system. It is impossible. The only way to ensure that your physical words, your sound words, and your spoken words perfectly align is to actually feel the emotions you are expressing. When you tell the unvarnished truth, your body automatically harmonizes with your message. This requires you to argue from the place where your deepest, most guarded feelings reside. You must speak from the core of your being, exposing your fears, your inadequacies, and your genuine desires. Most people hide behind a polished veneer. We wear psychological suits of armor to conceal who we really are. We want to appear strong, competent, and flawless. However, the great pretenses win nothing. When you puff yourself up to look like an invincible giant, the audience instantly disconnects. They know it is an act. They know that underneath the armor, you are just as fragile as they are. Standing naked means stripping away these protective layers. It means having the courage to say you are afraid, if you are truly afraid. It means admitting you do not know the answer when you are unsure. It means openly confessing your own flaws before your opponent can use them against you. When you trust your audience enough to disrobe your psyche in front of them, a powerful psychological dynamic occurs. The audience recognizes that you are real. Because you have taken the monumental risk of being vulnerable, they instinctively reciprocate by trusting you. Honesty is the ultimate biological advantage in human communication. Let us look at a real-life application involving a complex sales negotiation. A software sales representative named Mark is pitching a massive enterprise solution to a skeptical board of directors. The board has already listened to 3 other vendors who presented flawless, slick, and completely unbelievable pitches. Every other vendor claimed their software was perfect, easy to install, and guaranteed to solve every problem. The board members sat with their arms crossed, their psychic tentacles detecting the desperate deception in every polished slide. Mark decides to abandon his rehearsed presentation. He walks to the front of the room, turns off the projector, and looks the board members in the eyes. He tells them the absolute truth. He says his software is incredibly powerful, but the implementation process is going to be a nightmare. He admits that their staff will hate the new system for the first 3 months. He openly confesses that his company's customer support was terrible last year, though they have recently hired new management to fix it. He lays out all the painful, ugly realities of the transition. The board members lean forward in their chairs. Their crossed arms drop. For the first time all day, they are hearing the truth. By standing naked and exposing the flaws of his own product, Mark establishes absolute, unshakable credibility. He answers the objections they were secretly harboring before they even have to ask. Because he was brutally honest about the negatives, the board completely believes him when he passionately describes the long-term financial benefits of the software. Mark wins the multi-million-dollar contract not because his product was flawless, but because his credibility was absolute. Chapter 5. The Power of Listening and Hearing. The Person Behind the Noise. If you were required to choose only one essential skill to master the art of argument, it must be the ability to listen. You can possess perfect logic and immense charisma, but if you cannot understand where the other person is coming from, you are arguing into a void. Listening is not merely the passive act of waiting for your turn to speak. It is a highly active, strategic process of gathering critical intelligence. You must learn to hear what people are saying, and more importantly, you must learn to hear what they are deliberately not saying. When you enter an argument, you will frequently encounter hostility, shouting, and rigid defensiveness. A poor arguer reacts to this noise by raising their own voice and returning fire. A master of persuasion steps back from the noise and listens to the emotional current driving the outburst. People rarely argue about the actual issue at hand. The screaming, the stubbornness, and the vicious insults are almost always a desperate mask for underlying pain. If people are never heard and never understood, they feel profoundly alone. This loneliness and frustration breed a quiet terror that eventually explodes into rage. You must learn to listen with your soul's ear. Your logical mind can only process a fraction of the information presented during an interaction. Your intuitive, emotional self absorbs millions of subtle data points regarding the speaker's breathing, posture, and vocal tension. When you encounter explosive anger, you must ask yourself what hidden injury is driving the cacophony. Anger is a secondary emotion. It is a defensive mechanism deployed to protect a tender, wounded part of the psyche. Anger always covers hurt, fear, disappointment, jealousy, or a deep sense of betrayal. Understanding the concept of surrogate rage is absolutely critical. Often, the anger directed at you has absolutely nothing to do with your actions. Think of the dynamic in a dysfunctional corporate hierarchy. The board of directors humiliates the president. The president, feeling helpless and enraged, attacks the vice president. The vice president screams at the floor manager. The foreman then brutally berates a line worker for a minor infraction. Finally, the line worker goes home and yells at his spouse. The spouse is the victim of surrogate rage. The anger has been passed down the chain to a safe, available target. When a boss, a judge, or a partner attacks you unfairly, you must listen for the true source of the pain. If you react defensively, you validate their aggression and escalate the war. If you remain calm and listen deeply, you can often identify the real issue. Sometimes the best argument you can make is to provide a vast, quiet space for the other person to exhaust their displaced anger. Once the storm of surrogate rage blows over, the exhausted individual is usually left feeling vulnerable and far more open to a rational, empathetic discussion. Listening with your eyes is just as important as listening with your ears. The physical body always betrays the secrets of the mind. You must observe the tension in a person's jaw, the tapping of their fingers, and the direction of their gaze. A person who crosses their arms tightly across their chest is physically shielding their vital organs from an emotional assault. A person who touches their face or covers their mouth while speaking is often subconsciously trying to hold back the truth. By observing these physical manifestations of internal states, you gather the intelligence needed to craft a precise, compassionate, and ultimately victorious response. Consider a real-life application of active listening in a high-tension customer service environment. An airline gate agent is confronted by a passenger whose flight has been cancelled due to a mechanical failure. The passenger is purple with rage, screaming insults at the agent and threatening to sue the airline. A novice agent would argue back, citing the airline's legal policies and demanding that the passenger lower his voice. This would only guarantee a complete meltdown and the involvement of airport security. The master agent understands the mechanics of surrogate rage and the pain behind the noise. She does not take the insults personally. She maintains soft, steady eye contact and listens intently without interrupting. She listens to the frantic rhythm of the man's voice and hears the underlying panic. When the man finally runs out of breath, the agent does not mention the mechanical failure. Instead, she speaks softly to the core fear she has identified. She says she can hear how incredibly important it is for him to get to his destination tonight. She asks if he is trying to make it to a critical family event or a career-defining meeting. The man, shocked that someone actually heard his internal panic instead of just his external rage, instantly deflates. His shoulders drop, and his eyes well up with tears. He confesses that his daughter is having emergency surgery in 3 hours, and he is terrified he will not be there when she wakes up. The anger was nothing but a mask for his overwhelming helplessness. Because the agent listened to the pain, rather than fighting the noise, she transforms an enemy into an ally. She then aggressively utilizes every resource at her disposal to reroute him on a competitor's airline. She wins the interaction completely, not by arguing, but by deploying the unbeatable power of profound listening. Chapter 6. The Power of Prejudice and Bleaching the Stain. Prejudice acts as an impenetrable lock upon the human mind. Nothing new can enter, nothing true can escape. Peeping into a prejudiced mind is like opening the door to a room packed to the ceiling with hoarded junk. When the door opens, the junk simply comes tumbling out. Those whose minds are jammed with prejudice have room for little else. Intellectual growth is dead. Learning is completely gridlocked. You can drown the prejudiced person in reason, scream, weep, and beg, but your logical pleas for fairness and justice will go for naught. The word root of prejudice implies prejudgment. People are prejudiced both for and against philosophies, religions, belief systems, political parties, and other groups of people. Our prejudices are a deeply ingrained part of our personality structure. The core problem is that our prejudices lie lurking at the bottom of the subterranean mind, where they slowly ooze up and color our thinking without our conscious awareness. Prejudice can be derived from a cruel or neglectful parent. It can grow out of childhood terror, from being forced to do loathsome tasks, or from having endured undeserved punishments. Prejudices, much like severe phobias, are so deeply set that even if we become aware of them, we are usually helpless to simply erase them. Arguments do not erase prejudice any more than arguments erase physical scars. We must accept this psychological reality before we attempt to persuade anyone of anything. Arguing directly into the face of a deeply held prejudice is like hollering at a brick wall. When we witness an opponent reject a perfectly logical, flawless argument, we must realize that our failure was not in the argument itself. Our failure was in not uncovering the hidden prejudice and learning how to deal with it strategically. One of the most effective ways to anticipate and navigate the prejudices of others is to understand the concept of personality clusters. People's personalities, their likes and dislikes, their attitudes, their viewpoints, and their prejudices come in clusters. These clusters are much like grapes on a vine. If you examine one grape on the cluster, you will know exactly what the rest of the grapes look and taste like. If you know a person's occupation, background, and general social standing, you can accurately predict a vast array of their closely held beliefs. A corporate banker, for example, possesses a very specific attitudinal cluster. The banker likely believes that unemployed people are lazy. The banker likely favors free trade, opposes corporate taxation, and believes the government should stay out of private business affairs. A blue-collar factory worker possesses a completely different personality cluster. The factory worker likely resents the wealth of the banker, supports strong labor unions, and believes the government should heavily regulate corporate profits. While individuals are unique, human beings inevitably absorb the prejudices of their environments and their peer groups. When you identify the cluster a person belongs to, you can accurately anticipate the prejudices that will block your argument. The most impenetrable prejudice of all is the prejudice of self-interest. When the other person realizes that their personal survival, financial security, or social status is at risk, no winning argument is possible. The survival instinct is stamped deeply into human genetics. It overrides every thinking brain cell of the species. You cannot win when the other person is asked to decide against their own self-interest. To succeed in the face of this barrier, you must reframe your argument so that agreeing with you actually serves the self-interest of your opponent. You must empower them to see how your proposed solution protects their ultimate well-being. We can see the destructive power of prejudice in the societal habit of judging people solely on the bare facts of their worst mistakes. We judge the criminal on the bare fact of the crime. We do not ask why the crime occurred. We do not look at the lifetime of abuse, poverty, and systemic neglect that forged the criminal's behavior. To persuade a decision-maker to show mercy, you must crawl inside the hide of the accused. You must expose the secret, painful world in which the person lives. By revealing the hidden context, you neutralize the prejudice of the bare facts and awaken the irresistible power of human empathy. Consider a real-life application of overcoming prejudice through self-interest. A community organizer is trying to convince a wealthy neighborhood board to approve the construction of an affordable housing complex nearby. The board members are deeply prejudiced against the project. They harbor unspoken biases against low-income families and fear their property values will plummet. The organizer knows that presenting statistical data about housing inequality will completely fail. The organizer knows that appealing to their moral conscience will only make them defensive. The board's prejudice is locked tight by their financial self-interest. The organizer completely abandons the moral argument. Instead, the organizer researches the personality cluster of the board members and discovers their primary self-interest is maintaining the exclusive, peaceful atmosphere of their neighborhood. The organizer attends the meeting and aligns with their exact desires. The organizer argues that the city is planning to rezone the vacant lot anyway. If the board rejects this specific, highly regulated, architecturally beautiful housing project, the city will likely sell the land to a commercial developer. The organizer paints a vivid picture of a noisy 24-hour commercial strip mall, bringing relentless traffic, bright neon lights, and late-night loitering right to their doorsteps. The organizer then presents the affordable housing complex as a quiet, heavily landscaped, family-oriented buffer that will permanently block any commercial development. The organizer shows how the proposed complex will actually increase the neighborhood's security and maintain its residential purity. By reframing the affordable housing project as a shield against a much greater threat to their property values, the organizer bypasses their initial prejudice. The board members vote to approve the project. They do not approve it because they suddenly care about affordable housing. They approve it because the organizer successfully aligned the argument with their absolute self-interest. Chapter 7. The Power of Words and Gilding the Soliloquy. The most persuasive arguments shimmer with visual imagery and dazzle with visceral metaphor. We live in a culture that increasingly relies on sterile, intellectual abstractions to communicate. We hide behind corporate jargon, legalistic phrasing, and complicated academic vocabulary. This type of language acts as a protective steel net. We use big words to prove we are educated and to shield ourselves from true emotional connection. The problem is that this steel net works in both directions. It protects us, but it also completely blocks the other person from feeling the impact of our argument. Words that do not create immediate mental images should be discarded. Words that have no intrinsic emotional or visual content must be avoided. You must abandon the language of the plodding, logical brain and embrace the language of the heart zone. The creative gifts of everyday people provide the best templates for powerful speech. A manual laborer who recklessly maims the English language to describe a frustrating situation is infinitely more persuasive than an English professor who speaks with brutal, lifeless perfection. The language of the working person is earthy, direct, and soaked in genuine feeling. You must learn to paint pictures with your words. Instead of saying a situation is inherently dangerous, you must describe the exact physical mechanics of the danger. Instead of saying a man suffered grave emotional distress, you must describe the man sitting alone at a cold kitchen table, staring at a pile of final notices, while the winter wind rattles the frozen window panes. You must make the listener see the scene. You must make them feel the cold and experience the exhaustion. If you explain things in the abstract, the audience grows impatient. Abstractions force the listener to do the hard work of translating vague concepts into mental images. Most listeners will simply tune out and ignore you. The actual sound of your voice carries far more meaning than the dictionary definitions of the words you choose. The voice plays the music of the soul. If you read a transcript of a passionate argument, the words might seem clumsy and broken. But when delivered live, the rhythmic cadence, The rising crescendo and the sudden drop to a whisper create a spellbinding effect. This phenomenon is known as charisma. Charisma is not a mystical aura granted to a lucky few. Charisma is simply the uninhibited transfer of pure emotional energy from the speaker to the listener. You cannot manufacture charisma if you do not genuinely feel the emotion you are trying to convey. If you speak of terrible anger, but your voice sounds like a low, monotonous drone, the audience will not believe you. True anger originates from the depths of the chest and explodes outward. True sorrow catches in the throat and forces a physical reaction. To be charismatic, you must visualize a reservoir of feeling inside yourself. You must open the floodgates and let that raw emotion saturate every word you speak. When your physical gestures and vocal tones perfectly match your internal feelings, you become an unstoppable force of persuasion. We must also be fiercely aware of the physical words we use. Body language communicates our true intentions long before we open our mouths. A person who smiles continuously while discussing a tragic event is sending a deeply conflicting message. The audience's psychic tentacles will immediately detect the fraud. To be believed, you must stop pretending. You must stand naked before your audience. You must allow your body to naturally reflect your genuine emotional state. Let us examine a real-life application of visual, emotionally resonant language in a corporate crisis. A newly hired chief executive officer is tasked with turning around a massive manufacturing company that is bleeding money and facing imminent bankruptcy. The previous executives had held endless meetings where they displayed abstract charts, discussed leveraging synergies, and talked about optimizing cross-functional paradigms. The workers were completely alienated, apathetic, and terrified of losing their jobs. The corporate jargon meant absolutely nothing to them. The new CEO calls a town hall meeting on the factory floor. He does not bring a single chart. He does not use a single piece of corporate vocabulary. He walks to the center of the room, rolls up his sleeves, and looks the exhausted workers in the eyes. He tells them the company is a massive ship that has hit an iceberg. He says the water is rushing into the lower decks and the engines are failing. He points to the heavy machinery and says that every piece of scrap metal and every wasted hour is another gallon of water dragging them down to the bottom of the ocean. He then changes his tone from grim reality to fierce determination. He tells them he refuses to let the ship sink. He says he needs every single person in the room to grab a bucket and start bailing water. He paints a picture of a repaired, reinforced vessel breaking through the storm and sailing into calm, profitable waters where their jobs are safe and their families are secure. He promises that if they bail the water with him now, they will all share in the bounty when the ship reaches the port. The workers do not hear abstract financial goals. They hear a desperate story of survival. They see the sinking ship, they feel the urgency, and they instantly rally behind the CEO. The company is saved because the leader discarded the steel net of corporate jargon and embraced the supreme power of visual storytelling. Chapter 8. Structuring the winning argument and building the house. The wolf cannot blow down. Every argument you make, whether delivered across the supper table or presented to a formal committee, must have a structure. An argument is like a house. Whether it will stand firm or be blown away by your opponent depends entirely upon how the foundation has been built. The strongest, most indestructible structure for any human argument is always a story. Storytelling is the principal means by which humanity has transferred knowledge since the dawn of time. We are biologically wired to be story creatures. The stories we absorbed in our childhood remain the primary framework against which we judge the world as adults. A story touches us in our vulnerable emotional centers where all true decisions are made. When you explain facts or cite statistics, you engage the listener's critical defensive intellect. When you tell a compelling story, the listener drops their guard and steps inside the narrative. You do not have to memorize a story. You already know the sequence of events because you can see them clearly in your mind's eye. Before you can tell an effective story to others, you must first prepare obsessively. Preparation is the magical process of wading into the facts, rolling in the details, and absorbing every nuance of the situation. Genius is not a fortunate arrangement of brain cells. Genius is simply directed energy and relentless preparation. You must gather all the raw data, Sort through the gross material and distill it down to the absolute essence. Once you have complete mastery over the facts, you can begin to shape the narrative structure. The structure of the winning argument is built by asking 4 simple questions. First, what do you want? You must know your ultimate objective. Second, what is the principal argument that supports your objective? This is your core thesis. Third, why should you win what you want? This requires identifying the specific facts and the fundamental justice that supports your thesis. Finally, what is the story that best delivers all of these elements to the listener? Once you have outlined these elements, you must discover the theme. The theme is a descriptive phrase, a metaphor, or a short slogan that symbolizes the absolute soul of your case. In a case involving corporate pollution, the theme might be that the company is treating the community like a toxic dumping ground. The theme serves as a recurring musical refrain that anchors the listener's attention. Whenever the argument becomes complex, you return to the simple, memorable theme. The theme creates a mental image that is far more moving than hours of logical explanation. You must never write out an argument word for word and then read it to your audience. A written speech delivered aloud is like a stuffed grizzly bear mounted in a glass case. It may look fearsome, but everyone knows it is dead and harmless. The written argument lacks all spontaneity, rhythm, and life. A true magical argument must come exploding forth from the heart zone. It must bear the raw, unpolished marks of authenticity. The broken sentences, the passionate false starts, and the emotional pacing are the very elements that make the argument credible. You must prepare the facts thoroughly, outline the story, internalize the theme, and then have the supreme courage to step up and deliver it without a script. Let us examine a real-life application of structuring a story-based argument in a high-stakes personal negotiation. A patient requires a specialized, life-saving medical treatment that is wildly expensive. The patient's insurance company has denied the claim, citing a complex bureaucratic loophole regarding out-of-network providers. The patient must appeal the decision to a panel of insurance executives. The patient knows that arguing about the technical definitions in the insurance policy will result in a swift and clinical defeat. The executives are experts at using the policy language to protect their profit margins. The patient decides to build a house the wolf cannot blow down. The patient prepares by gathering all the medical records, but then sets them aside to focus on the story. The thesis is that human life is worth more than a bureaucratic technicality. The theme of the argument is simply the phrase, a matter of survival. The patient enters the boardroom and does not look at a single note. The patient looks the executives in the eyes and begins the story at the climax. The patient describes the terrifying moment the doctor delivered the fatal diagnosis. The patient paints a vivid picture of driving home that day, gripping the steering wheel, wondering how to tell their young children that their parent might not be there for graduation. The patient describes the physical agony of the disease, the sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of the fear. The patient then introduces the insurance policy not as a legal contract, but as a lifeline that was promised to them in exchange for years of loyal premium payments. The patient argues that denying the claim is not a business decision. Denying the claim is a conscious choice to cut the lifeline and let a human being drown in a sea of corporate paperwork. The patient finishes the story by stating exactly what is wanted. The patient demands that the panel approve the treatment and honor the spirit of the protection they sell. The executives, who spend their days looking at spreadsheets and abstract claim numbers, are suddenly forced to look at a living, breathing human being fighting for survival. The patient's raw, unscripted, story-driven argument bypasses the intellectual defenses of the executives. The panel, moved by the undeniable reality of the human narrative, finds an administrative exception and approves the life-saving treatment. The patient wins because the argument was structured as an unforgettable story. Part 2. Delivering the winning argument. Chapter 9. Opening them up and bridging the gap. You can possess the most beautifully constructed argument in the world, but it will fail entirely if the other person refuses to listen. The human mind is like a fortress equipped with heavy steel doors and complex security systems. When people feel threatened, they instinctively slam these doors shut and lock them from the inside. They put in their mental earplugs. You can shout your brilliant logic into the void, but your words will merely bounce off their defensive walls. To deliver a winning argument, you must first learn the delicate art of opening the other person up so they actually want to hear what you have to say. People close themselves off because they are afraid. This fear takes many forms. They fear that if they accept your argument, they will look weak or foolish. They worry that agreeing with you means admitting they were wrong all along. They are terrified of losing their power, their status, or their sense of control. If your argument threatens their well-being in any way, their biological defense mechanisms will activate. They might argue back, they might yell, or they might simply stare at you with blank, hostile eyes. The underlying reality remains the same in all these scenarios. They are not listening to a single word you are speaking. The secret to bypassing these heavy defensive walls is remarkably simple. You must give them all the power. You must explicitly empower the other person to reject your argument. By voluntarily putting your power into their hands, you completely eliminate their fear of being controlled. When you acknowledge that the final decision rests solely with them, you remove the threat. There is no longer anything for them to fight against. When the threat vanishes, the steel doors slowly begin to open. Imagine you want a friend to try a very strange and unappealing dish you have just cooked. If you shove the plate in their face and demand they eat it to prove their friendship, they will recoil in disgust and anger. They will feel manipulated and cornered. Their natural reaction will be to reject the food and resent you for forcing it upon them. However, if you simply place the dish on the table, casually mention how much you enjoy it, and tell them they do not have to touch it if they do not want to, the dynamic changes entirely. You have removed the pressure. By granting them the absolute freedom to say no, you arouse their natural curiosity. They are now far more likely to take a bite on their own terms. This exact dynamic governs every human interaction. You cannot stuff an argument down the throat of another person. You can only present it and empower them to choose. Consider the story of a lost, starving hunter who stumbles upon the remote cabin of a famously hostile hermit. If the hunter kicks down the door and points his rifle at the hermit to demand food, a violent shootout will inevitably occur. The hunter will either be killed or become a murderer. Instead, the wise hunter knocks gently on the door. When the angry hermit opens it, the hunter hands over his own loaded rifle, butt first. The hunter then politely asks if he might trade his weapon for a warm meal. By handing over his weapon, the hunter makes himself completely vulnerable. He transfers all physical power to the hermit. The hermit, holding the gun and realizing he is in absolute control, immediately feels safe. His fear and hostility dissolve. Feeling respected and secure, the hermit invites the hunter inside, feeds him, and eventually returns the weapon. This is the exact psychological mechanism you must employ in your arguments. You must hand over your metaphorical weapon and make the other person feel entirely safe in their authority. You can apply this empowering technique in your daily life. If you want to pitch a radical new workflow to a stubborn traditional boss, you do not march into his office and declare that his current system is broken. That approach attacks his competence and forces him to defend his territory. Instead, you sit down and hand him the power. You tell him that you have been working on a concept, but you realize he has the final say and the superior experience. You ask if he would be willing to simply look at the idea and discard it if it lacks merit. The boss, realizing he is under no pressure to implement the plan, relaxes his posture. You have validated his authority and stroked his ego just enough to make him comfortable. Because he knows he can kill the idea with a single word, he actually listens to your presentation. He evaluates the logic without the blinding interference of a bruised ego. By giving him the power to say no, you drastically increase the probability that he will say yes. You must also avoid the common traps that instantly alienate an audience. Many speakers attempt to bridge the gap by starting with a joke. This is a highly dangerous strategy. If the joke falls flat, the speaker suffers an immediate, devastating loss of credibility. The audience is forced into an awkward, pitying silence. Furthermore, jokes set a tone of light-hearted entertainment. If your goal is to deliver a serious, impactful message, starting with a joke creates a jarring psychological disconnect. You are asking the audience to view you as a comedian 1 second and a profound thinker the next. This rapid shift destroys the organic flow of the argument. Patronizing the audience is another guaranteed way to permanently lock their minds against you. Beginning an argument by showering the listeners with exaggerated, insincere praise insults their intelligence. People possess highly tuned radar for sycophants and manipulators. When you tell a group of strangers that they are the most brilliant and beautiful people you have ever met, they know you are lying. They instantly classify you as a fraud who wants something from them. The only reliable way to bridge the gap between you and the other person is to tell the unvarnished truth. You must stand naked and establish a genuine human connection based on reality. If you are facing a hostile crowd, you must verbally acknowledge that hostility. You might step to the podium and state plainly that you know they disagree with you and that you feel intimidated by their collective anger. Admitting your fear and naming the tension in the room instantly diffuses it. The audience realizes you are not a polished corporate robot. They see a vulnerable human being trying to connect. This honest admission earns their grudging respect, and respect is the necessary prerequisite for persuasion. Chapter 10. How to deliver the argument and releasing the sound and fury. The human voice is an extraordinary biological instrument. If we did not possess this specific vocal apparatus, we would have to communicate our feelings by beating on drums or bowing the strings of a violin. We often forget that the voice is fundamentally designed to make music. It is the music of the voice, not the dictionary definition of the words, that carries the true emotional weight of any argument. Words are merely the agreed-upon societal conduits we use to structure our thoughts. The sound of those words is what actually penetrates the heart of the listener. You can test this reality by observing the way people speak in everyday life. You can read the phrase indicating you are the happiest person in the world in a flat, robotic monotone. The words themselves signify joy, but the delivery completely contradicts the message. No one listening to that monotone drone will believe you are experiencing happiness. Conversely, you can read a random page from a telephone directory while channeling a feeling of absolute, uncontrollable rage. The listener will not care about the names and numbers you are reciting. They will instantly step back, recognizing the terrifying power of the anger vibrating in your chest. Many professionals, particularly in corporate and legal environments, completely strip the music from their voices. They stand before their audiences and emit a dead, wooden scraping sound. They read from heavily researched documents with the enthusiasm of a coroner reading an autopsy report. They put judges to sleep. They bore their colleagues into a state of catatonic misery, and they wonder why their flawless logic fails to motivate anyone. They fail because they are broadcasting dead air. An argument devoid of emotional sound is like a beautifully painted portrait locked in a pitch-black room. The magical element that transforms a speaker into a mesmerizing force is called charisma. Charisma is not a mystical gift bestowed upon a chosen few at birth. Charisma is simply the unfiltered transfer of pure emotional energy from the speaker to the audience. To understand how this works, you must visualize your internal emotions as a deep reservoir of water. When you feel true passion, anger, or love, that reservoir bubbles and steams with kinetic energy. To deliver a charismatic argument, you must mentally drop a siphon hose into that reservoir of feeling. You must open the valve and let the emotion surge up through your chest, over your vocal cords, and out into the room. This raw energy activates the muscles of your face, directs the movement of your hands, and alters the rhythm of your breath. Your body automatically synchronizes with the truth of the emotion. This cohesive, explosive energy travels through the air and pours directly into the waiting reservoirs of the people listening to you. They become infected by your passion. They feel what you feel. To achieve this level of delivery, you must practice releasing your suppressed emotions. Most adults have spent decades learning to hide their feelings behind a mask of professional stoicism. We act as if expressing deep emotion is childish or inappropriate. To become a master of persuasion, you must unlearn this damaging behavior. You must take the terrifying risk of acting like an uninhibited child. You must go to a place where you are completely alone, far away from the judgmental eyes of society. Go deep into the woods, out into an empty desert, or stand alone on a desolate beach. Take off your shoes and feel the earth beneath your feet. Allow yourself to reconnect with the primal biological reality of your existence. You are a living creature capable of immense feeling. In this isolated space, You must practice making the raw sounds of your emotions. Do not try to form eloquent sentences. Simply focus on the feeling of a past anger or a profound joy. Let the feeling build in your stomach. When the pressure becomes unbearable, let the sound escape your throat. If you are focusing on anger, do not make a high, thin screech. Reach down into the lower lobes of your lungs and produce the deep guttural growl of a cornered animal. Feel the physical vibration in your chest. Shout the word that represents your pain into the wind. Pound your chest, swing your arms, and let the physical energy flow out of you without any mental restriction. This exercise will feel incredibly foolish at first. Your logical brain will mock you and tell you to stop behaving like a lunatic. You must ignore the logical brain and push through the embarrassment. This practice breaks the psychological cast that has immobilized your emotional expression for years. By learning to freely vocalize your raw feelings in private, you build the muscular and emotional memory required to channel that same energy when you are standing in front of an audience. Consider the real-life application of this principle during a critical community town hall meeting. A neighborhood has just suffered a devastating flood due to the negligence of a local dam operator. A community leader steps up to the microphone to demand accountability from the government officials seated on the stage. If the leader simply reads a list of statistical damages in a polite, controlled voice, the officials will offer bureaucratic apologies and change nothing. Instead, the community leader taps into the reservoir of collective grief and righteous fury. The leader does not yell out of control, but speaks with a deep, vibrating resonance that shakes the room. The leader describes the sight of ruined homes and lost heirlooms, letting the natural crack of sorrow break through their voice. The leader pauses, letting the heavy, suffocating silence amplify the pain. When the leader demands justice, the words are not requests. They are physical blows powered by the unfiltered emotion of a wounded community. The officials on the stage physically recoil from the sheer force of the delivery. The leader wins the argument because the delivery was saturated in undeniable, raw, human truth. Chapter 11. The Magical Argument and Arguing Out of the Heart Zone. The ultimate expression of persuasion is a phenomenon known as the magical argument. This type of argument does not originate in the cold, calculating centers of the intellectual brain. It erupts spontaneously from the heart zone, bypassing logic and striking directly at the emotional core of the listener. The magical argument is not a performance of the conscious mind. It is an artistic masterpiece orchestrated by the subconscious, delivered with a power that transcends ordinary human speech. Speech teachers and academic professors often teach what they know, which is the linear, methodical construction of sentences. They teach you to rely on perfectly formatted notes and meticulously timed gestures. This academic approach produces arguments that are technically flawless, but emotionally dead. Reading a highly polished, heavily edited speech to an audience is like presenting them with a taxidermy animal. The stuffed bear in the museum case has its mouth open in a roar, and its claws are extended in a terrifying pose. However, the audience feels no fear because they know the bear is completely lifeless. The magical argument is the live grizzly bear crashing through the forest. It is terrifying, unpredictable, and breathtakingly real. When you deliver an argument directly from the soul, it carries the marks of authentic, unpolished life. The sentences might be grammatically imperfect. You might stumble over a transition or use a slightly awkward phrasing. These imperfections are exactly what make the argument credible. The audience intuitively understands that a person speaking the profound truth is not concerned with flawless syntax. They are concerned entirely with transferring their passionate conviction into the minds of their listeners. To achieve the magical argument, you must synthesize two opposing forces. The first force is absolute, relentless preparation. You must study the facts of your case, the desires of your audience, and the structure of your story until you know them intimately. You must outline the argument, refine the theme, and explore every possible vulnerability. You must fill your intellectual reservoir with so much data that it overflows. The second force is complete, fearless surrender. Once you have prepared exhaustively, you must walk to the podium and throw your notes away. You must step to the edge of the psychological cliff and jump into the void. This requires the ultimate courage to be. You must trust that the deep preparation you have done has successfully programmed your subconscious mind. When you let go of conscious control, your inner self will take over the presentation. Your subconscious will automatically retrieve the right facts, choose the most impactful words, and orchestrate the physical delivery with perfect organic timing. This experience is terrifying. It is akin to jumping out of an airplane and waiting to pull the ripcord. As you stand before the audience without a safety net, your stomach will tighten and your heart will pound. You will feel a desperate urge to run back to your desk and grab your written speech. You must resist this urge. You must embrace the terror and look your audience in the eyes. You must allow the silence to stretch until the tension in the room is palpable. Then, you open your mouth and let the truth pour out. Consider the real-life application of the magical argument in a courtroom setting. A seasoned defense attorney is delivering the closing argument in a trial where an innocent client is facing a life sentence. The attorney has spent 3 months preparing a flawless 50-page closing statement. As the attorney stands up to address the jury, a sudden realization hits. Reading the 50 pages will bore the jury and drain all the humanity from the plea. The attorney's client is a living person whose entire future hangs in the balance, not a legal abstraction. The attorney takes the thick binder of notes and deliberately drops it onto the defense table. The heavy thud echoes through the silent courtroom. The attorney walks slowly toward the jury box, leaving the safety of the podium behind. For a long moment, the attorney says nothing, simply looking into the eyes of each juror, sharing the heavy, terrifying burden of the moment. The attorney feels the raw fear for the client's life expanding in the chest. When the attorney finally speaks, the voice is quiet, trembling slightly with genuine emotion. The attorney does not recite legal precedents or complex timelines. The attorney tells the story of the client's life, speaking directly from the heart zone. The attorney's hands move naturally, painting pictures of the night in question. The words flow without conscious effort, driven entirely by a desperate need to save an innocent soul. The attorney cries real tears, and several jurors begin to weep as well. The attorney does not think about the next sentence because the subconscious mind is effortlessly guiding the narrative to its devastating, powerful conclusion. The jury returns a verdict of not guilty in less than an hour. This level of persuasion cannot be faked. It requires you to operate from the absolute center of your universe. You must recognize this lurking control mechanism and actively dismantle it. You can visualize the self as a precious, one-of-a-kind cup filled with your unique personality, your creativity, and your specific worldview. When you enter a relationship, you share the contents of your cup, but you must never give the cup itself away. By the same token, you must never attempt to seize your partner's cup. You must leave your weapons of control at the door. You cannot truly love someone while simultaneously holding a psychological gun to their head. To resolve conflicts without destroying the relationship, you must learn to yield. Giving up the need to control is often misinterpreted as weakness or failure. In reality, relinquishing control is the ultimate demonstration of emotional strength and profound security. When you stop trying to force your partner to conform to your desires, you create a safe environment where mutual respect can flourish. You must accept that your partner has an absolute right to their own opinions, their own tastes, and their own irrational quirks. Imagine a couple trapped in a vicious, escalating argument over financial spending. The husband accuses the wife of being financially irresponsible. The wife accuses the husband of being a selfish, controlling tyrant. The argument quickly descends into a brutal exchange of character assassinations and historical grievances. They are no longer discussing the budget. They are actively trying to eviscerate each other's self-worth. If they continue this slash-and-burn approach, the trust between them will be permanently incinerated. To win this scenario, one of the partners must intentionally lose the battle for control. The husband could stop the escalation by simply validating the wife's underlying pain. He could drop his defensive posture and acknowledge that his rigid financial rules make her feel trapped and unvalued. By admitting his own fear of financial ruin, he stands naked before her. He removes the threat of domination. When he stops trying to win the argument, the wife's defensive walls instantly collapse. She is then free to acknowledge her own emotional spending habits without feeling attacked. They win the ultimate prize, which is the preservation of their love, by mutually agreeing to lose the argument over who was right. Anger is a constant presence in any healthy, living relationship. A marriage completely devoid of anger is a marriage between two emotionally dead individuals who are terrified of authentic connection. However, anger is a secondary emotion. It is a loud, aggressive mask designed to cover a much softer, more vulnerable wound. Anger is always the result of feeling hurt, abandoned, terrified, or betrayed. When your partner hurls anger at you, you must train yourself to ignore the aggressive noise and hunt for the underlying pain. If you react to your partner's anger with your own retaliatory rage, you guarantee mutual destruction. You must instead view their anger as a distorted plea for understanding. You must step back from the emotional hurricane and ask yourself what specific injury is driving their outburst. When the storm recedes, you must address the hurt directly. You can quietly state that you see their pain and that you want to understand it because you love them. This disarming approach forces the hidden wound into the light. Once the root cause of the pain is acknowledged and validated, the protective shell of anger melts away. You must heavily edit your language when communicating with your loved ones. In the heat of passion, it is incredibly easy to launch a verbal missile that causes irreparable psychological injury. You have the ability to control your language in the workplace. You do not curse at your boss or insult a police officer because you know the consequences are severe. You must apply that exact same level of rigorous self-control in your home. You must treat the psyche of your partner with the utmost reverence. You win the arguments of love by prioritizing the emotional safety of the other person above your own fleeting desire for vindication. Chapter 14. Arguing with Kids and the Magic Mirror of Parenting. Society operates under the deeply flawed assumption that successful parenting requires absolute control, rigid discipline, and the constant assertion of authority. Parents are encouraged to act as omnipotent dictators, molding their children like blocks of inanimate clay. This authoritarian approach is a catastrophic failure of human understanding. When you use raw power to crush the will of a child, you do not create a good citizen. You create a deeply neurotic, fearful, and resentful individual who will eventually rebel against you and society with destructive force. The parent-child relationship operates as a flawless magic mirror. Whatever energy you project into the child is exactly what the child will reflect back into the world. If you want a child who exhibits love, you must provide unconditional love. If you desire a child who demonstrates respect, you must treat the child with absolute respect from the moment they are born. If you demand a child who blindly obeys your commands out of terror, you will inevitably raise a child who uses intimidation and violence to control others. You always reap the behavioral harvest that you have sown. Children possess an incredibly high level of emotional intelligence and a nearly perfect sense of natural justice. They know when they are being manipulated. They know when they are being unfairly repressed. They recognize hypocrisy with stunning accuracy. Many parents believe they are arguing with their children for the child's own good. In reality, parents often argue with their children because the parent is terrified of social judgment. The parent demands conformity because a misbehaving child threatens the parent's own fragile ego and public image. Preaching is one of the most toxic forms of parental control. Delivering endless moral sermons to a captive audience of children does not instill strong values. Preaching is simply an arrogant display of power. When a parent lectures a child about honesty, but regularly lies to get out of social obligations, the child learns that hypocrisy is the true rule of the world. Moral values are never transferred through verbal reprimands. Values are absorbed exclusively through the daily, observable example set by the parent's actual behavior. You must recognize the terrifying disparity of power that exists between an adult and a child. A child relies on you for food, shelter, physical safety, and emotional survival. The child is a total captive in your environment. Because this power imbalance is so massive, even the mildest parental persuasion can quickly devolve into crushing oppression. You cannot have a fair argument with a person who is completely at your mercy. Therefore, your primary goal must be to get on the side of the child. You must become the child's strongest advocate rather than their warden. Children require vast amounts of physical and psychological space to grow. In their natural tribal state, humans lived in small, supportive communities surrounded by endless nature. Today, we force our children into concrete domestic prisons and rigid, institutionalized school systems. We deprive them of autonomy and punish them for exhibiting the natural, exploratory behaviors of a growing mammal. We demand that they suppress their boundless energy and sit silently in sterile classrooms. When they inevitably lash out against this unnatural confinement, we label them as problem children and medicate them into submission. To raise a successful human being, you must have the courage to grant your child freedom. This means allowing them to make their own mistakes and suffer the natural consequences of their actions. Short of protecting them from fatal physical danger, you must step back and let them navigate the world. The parent who argues against every risk the child takes completely destroys their own credibility. Mother Nature biologically prepares the young to absorb failures and learn from them. If you shield your child from every disappointment, you guarantee they will remain weak, dependent, and entirely incapable of surviving adulthood. Consider a practical application of this philosophy involving a high school senior and a terrified parent. The teenager announces that he has no intention of attending a university. He wants to move to the coast and work a minimum wage job so he can spend his days surfing. The authoritarian parent would immediately launch into a screaming lecture, threaten to cut off all financial support, and demand that the child fill out college applications. This aggressive attack would only solidify the teenager's rebellion and destroy the familial bond. The master parent approaches the situation by completely abandoning the use of power. The parent sits down with the teenager and refuses to preach. The parent openly confesses their own internal fear. The parent admits that they have spent their entire life trying to be a successful guide, and that watching the teenager choose a difficult path makes the parent feel like a failure. The parent stands naked, exposing their own vulnerability rather than attacking the child's logic. The parent then hands absolute control of the situation directly to the teenager. The parent states clearly that the teenager is now entirely responsible for their own survival, their own success, and their own future happiness. The parent relinquishes the desire to manage the outcome. By removing the oppressive force of parental expectation, the teenager is suddenly forced to confront the reality of their own choices. They no longer have an authority figure to fight against. Because the parent chose to respect the teenager's autonomy, the teenager feels loved and trusted. Whether the child ultimately chooses to surf or go to college is irrelevant. The argument was won because the parent successfully transitioned the child from a dependent captive into a responsible, self-directed adult. Chapter 15. Arguing at the workplace and engaging the corporate cyclops. The modern workplace is a deeply unnatural environment that operates contrary to the core needs of the human soul. Whether you are employed by a massive multinational corporation or a sprawling government bureaucracy, you are engaging with a lifeless, fictional entity. A corporation does not breathe. It does not possess a heart, a conscience, or a moral compass. It is a legal construct designed exclusively for the generation and accumulation of profit. Expecting loyalty, empathy, or justice from a corporate entity is a fundamental and dangerous delusion. When you argue at the workplace, you must understand the true nature of the beast you are facing. Corporations function like massive, rudderless ships drifting on the ocean. The people who work inside the corporation are merely the temporary crew. The executives and managers do not truly control the ship. They are swept along by the overwhelming inertia of the corporate structure itself. The primary objective of this structure is to convert human labor into financial capital. In this environment, the individual worker is viewed not as a human being, but as a disposable commodity or a raw cost of production. To survive and thrive in this environment, you must completely discard the concept of arguing for justice. Corporations do not deal in fairness. If you march into your manager's office and demand a raise because your rent has increased and your family is struggling, you will fail. The corporation does not care about your personal suffering. The corporation only cares about the bottom line. Every argument you make in the workplace must be strategically framed to demonstrate how your request will ultimately generate more profit or increase operational efficiency for the company. If you want a promotion, you cannot argue that you deserve it because of your unwavering loyalty or your years of service. You must argue that elevating you to a leadership position will allow you to train others to meet your high standards, thereby increasing the overall productivity of the department. If you want a raise, you must prove that the financial investment in your salary will allow you to focus more intensely on generating revenue for the firm. You must translate your personal needs into the cold, calculating language of corporate benefit. You must also understand the mechanics of corporate responsibility. The division of labor within a large organization allows individuals to participate in highly unethical and destructive practices without feeling personally responsible. The engineering department designs a flawed product to save money. The marketing department sells the dangerous product to the public. The legal department defends the company when people are injured. Because no single individual is entirely responsible for the final outcome, the corporate machine can inflict immense damage on society while the employees sleep soundly in their beds. The most powerful argument you can make for your own well-being in the workplace is to completely detach your self-worth from your job. The pursuit of ultimate corporate security is a myth that breeds total insecurity. Pensions can be dissolved, and entire departments can be eliminated with a single stroke of an executive's pen. If your identity is inextricably linked to your corporate title, a sudden layoff will completely destroy your psyche. You must view yourself as an independent contractor, renting your skills to the corporation, not as a dependent child seeking validation from a parental institution. True security comes from knowing that your value exists entirely independent of your employer. When you are deeply anchored in your own self-worth, you are not paralyzed by the fear of being fired. This fearlessness paradoxically makes you a far more valuable and powerful employee. You are willing to speak the truth, propose innovative solutions, and challenge inefficient systems because you are not terrified of the consequences. The sycophants and the yes-men who suck up to management are entirely disposable. The fearless, authentic worker who operates from their own internal authority is the one who eventually commands real respect and actual power. Consider a practical application of navigating the corporate environment. A dedicated employee discovers that their company is knowingly dumping toxic waste into a local river to avoid the cost of proper disposal. The employee's initial instinct is to storm into the boardroom, slam their fist on the table, and demand that the executives stop their evil, immoral behavior. This approach will result in the employee's immediate termination and the continuation of the pollution. The executives will view the employee as a hostile threat to their profit margins and eliminate them. The master of corporate argument approaches the situation differently. They understand that appealing to the corporation's non-existent conscience is useless. Instead, the employee gathers irrefutable data on the catastrophic financial risks the company is currently taking. The employee prepares a presentation outlining the massive government fines, the devastating loss of public goodwill, and the crippling legal settlements that will inevitably occur when the illegal dumping is discovered by regulatory agencies. The employee presents this data to the executives not as a moral crusade, but as a dire warning about an impending financial disaster. The employee shows the executives that the cost of proper waste disposal is drastically lower than the cost of surviving a massive environmental lawsuit. By framing the ethical choice as the most profitable and secure choice, the employee aligns the argument with the corporation's supreme self-interest. The executives immediately order a halt to the illegal dumping. The employee achieves a profoundly moral victory by expertly manipulating the amoral mechanics of the corporate machine. Chapter 16. Arguing for justice and the responsibility of being, discovering a permanent cure for a devastating illness and hiding that cure from the world would be considered an unforgivable crime against humanity. Every single human being possesses a completely unique, irreplaceable, and highly valuable inner self. This individual uniqueness is a magnificent treasure that must be carefully unearthed and generously shared with the rest of the world. You have an absolute moral duty to discover your own unique psychological makeup and present it authentically to your community. The most effective and necessary vehicle for sharing your authentic self with the world is the act of making an argument. When you refuse to argue for what is right, you effectively steal your precious self from the human race. This theft constitutes a permanent and eternal loss for all of society because your specific perspective can never be replicated. Occupying physical and emotional space on this earth comes with a heavy price. Part of that price is the undeniable obligation to speak out against wrongdoing whenever you encounter it. The most revered historical figures understood this fundamental responsibility of being. They did not sit idly by while tyrannical forces crushed the innocent. They recognized that witnessing an injustice without delivering an argument against it is a form of quiet complicity. You must adopt this exact same mindset in your everyday existence. You possess the skills to dismantle oppressive systems, and you must use them. You must argue when you see human beings unjustly used, disrespected, exploited, or physically injured. You must refuse to permit toxic and unjust statements to spread unabated in your presence. This duty to argue extends to every environment you navigate. You have a duty to argue for justice at your workplace, in your local government, and within the walls of your own home. You even have a profound duty to argue with yourself when you catch your own mind sliding into apathy or cowardly retreat. It is incredibly easy to remain aloof, uninvolved, and safely disconnected from the suffering of others. It is easy to sit in the comfort of your living room and pass self-righteous judgments on the evening news. It is easy to argue for strong moral convictions when your own livelihood, your own family, and your own physical safety are not at risk. The true test of a human being occurs when advocating for justice requires personal sacrifice. Only a rare few can entirely evade the trap of self-interest when the stakes are high. You must strive to be one of those rare individuals whose compelling personal need to bring about justice overrides their biological instinct for comfortable survival. You will inevitably encounter the massive, immovable prejudices of the society in which you live. Every culture is built upon a foundation of social biases that dictate what is considered acceptable behavior. We are conditioned to blindly worship profit systems and to instinctively recoil from anything labeled as an economic alternative. We assign unearned virtue to those who possess vast amounts of money, and we assign inherent criminality to those who live in crushing poverty. These social attitudes are highly predictable and incredibly controlling. You must learn to recognize these invisible currents of prejudice so you can effectively sail against them. The forces that dictate political correctness can be both beneficial and highly destructive to a society struggling for justice. While collective social pressure has helped dismantle certain systemic blights, it also frequently creates a suffocating environment of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is merely a socially agreed-upon prejudice that allows the majority to pass harsh judgments without ever examining the actual facts. When you argue for a despised person or an unpopular cause, you will face the absolute fury of this conventional wisdom. You must refuse to accept the lazy judgments handed down by the media, the government, or the local community. When a person is accused of a terrible crime, society immediately reduces that human being to the bare facts of the accusation. The public does not want to understand the horrific childhood abuse, the systemic neglect, or the crippling mental illness that forged the criminal act. The public simply wants a monster to hate so they can feel righteous and secure. You must reject this simplistic, cruel narrative. To argue for justice on behalf of the condemned, you must boldly crawl inside the hide of the despised individual. You must look past the bare facts and uncover the agonizing, secret world in which that person actually lives. There are always mitigating circumstances waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to look for them. When you expose the hidden pain of the wrongdoer, you force the decision-makers to confront their own humanity. You replace their comfortable hatred with uncomfortable empathy. Consider a highly detailed real-life application involving a community social worker fighting for justice against a massive predatory utility company. The utility company has systematically targeted a low-income immigrant neighborhood with illegal exorbitant rate hikes. The residents are terrified, unable to speak the language fluently, and completely ignorant of their legal rights. The bare facts presented by the utility company suggest that the residents are simply delinquent on their bills and deserve to have their power shut off during the freezing winter months. The social worker knows that filing a standard bureaucratic complaint will result in a meaningless automated denial, The utility company possesses a legion of corporate lawyers whose entire job is to crush marginalized voices using complex regulatory loopholes. The social worker decides to build an unbeatable power argument based entirely on human empathy and naked truth. She bypasses the low-level clerks and secures a speaking slot at the utility company's annual shareholder meeting. She does not bring charts, graphs, or angry protest signs. She walks to the microphone and refuses to use aggressive, insulting language. She understands that attacking the shareholders will only activate their defensive prejudices. Instead, she tells a meticulously crafted story about one specific family in the neighborhood. She describes an elderly grandmother dependent on an oxygen machine, living with her hard-working grandson, who works 3 minimum-wage jobs just to buy groceries. She paints a visceral, chilling picture of the night the power was suddenly disconnected. She describes the grandson frantically wrapping his grandmother in layers of thin blankets as the temperature in the apartment plummeted below freezing. She describes the terrifying silence of the oxygen machine shutting down. She makes the shareholders feel the absolute panic and the crushing helplessness of that exact moment. She then explains that the unpaid bill that triggered this life-threatening event was completely fraudulent, generated by a deliberate error in the company's billing software. She does not call the executives evil, nor does she accuse the shareholders of malice. She explicitly empowers them. She states that she knows they are decent people who invested in this company to build a secure future for their own families, not to freeze elderly women to death in the dark. She places the responsibility for justice directly into their hands. She demands that they use their supreme power as owners of the company to immediately halt the shutoffs and launch an independent audit of the billing practices. The shareholders, who had expected a shrill, politically charged rant, are completely disarmed by the raw humanity of the story. The social worker successfully bypassed their corporate defenses by crawling into the hide of the victims and forcing the audience to experience that specific pain. The emotional resonance of the magical argument shatters the conventional wisdom of the boardroom. The shareholders demand immediate action from the executive team, the predatory practices are exposed, and the neighborhood is protected. The social worker wins the war because she understood that the most powerful weapon for justice is an undeniable human narrative. You must also recognize that arguing for justice requires confronting the hypocrisies of the legal and corporate systems. The law is rarely designed to deliver pure justice. The law is a structural mechanism utilized by those in power to retain their power and protect their accumulated wealth. The law will frequently dignify a historical evil as a binding precedent rather than create a new avenue for fairness. You must not revere the law blindly. You must view the law as a flawed, malleable tool that can be bent toward justice only through the application of overwhelming narrative pressure. When you fight against the dead super-tribe of the modern bureaucracy, you must remain emotionally detached from their sterile outcomes. Bureaucracies do not possess a conscience, and they cannot be shamed into doing the right thing. You must align your demands for justice with their internal metrics of risk and public relations. You must show the lifeless entity that delivering justice is the only mathematically safe option available to them. Ultimately, arguing for justice is the highest expression of the self. When you stand naked before an audience, armed only with the truth of your convictions, you transcend the petty concerns of ego and status. You become a conduit for the fundamental moral imperatives of the universe. You prove that you are not merely a passive consumer or a compliant worker, but a fully realized human being capable of shaping the destiny of your community.